Welcome to the Principal Source audio presentation of The Nature of Free Will by David Kelley. Free will is a fundamental question in philosophy because it is the foundation of ethics. If man has no free choice in his actions, then he does not need a moral code of how to choose his actions from a range of alternatives. In its broadest sense, the idea of free will centers on the question of what is the place of the mind in nature. In part one of this talk, Dr. Kelley focuses on three basic issues: a formulation of the free will theory as opposed to the determinist position, Ayn Rand's theory of free will, and the argument that the existence of free will would violate the law of causality. Part two examines volition from a biological perspective and broadly outlines why the development and expansion of the brain, which led to man's conceptual form of cognition, could also have been expected to give rise to volition as well. A well-known philosopher, teacher, and writer, David Kelley earned his PhD in philosophy from Princeton University in 1975. He has since taught philosophy, cognitive sciences, and other courses at Vassar College and Brandeis University. Dr. Kelley's books include The Evidence of the Senses, The Art of Reasoning, and A Life of One's Own: Individual Rights and the Welfare State. He was recently featured on John Stossel's ABC TV news special, Greed, and is a popular lecturer and talk show guest. Dr. Kelley is founder and, since 1990, the executive director of the Institute for Objectivist Studies in Poughkeepsie, New York. This lecture was given in 1986 at the Portland Institute Conference. Dr. Kelley presented a fascinating extension of Ayn Rand's ideas on free will to show that man's volitional control over his consciousness is not only entirely consistent with the law of causality, but also acts as a regulator or governing mechanism over the contents of his consciousness.
My topic for today and next time is the nature of free will. Now, free will is a fundamental question in philosophy. It's a question of crucial importance. If you drew up a list of the top 10 questions in philosophy, free will would certainly be on it. It's one of the questions that any system of philosophy would have to have a position on to count as a significant philosophical system. And the chief reason for its importance is that it's the foundation of ethics. If we have no free choice over our actions, if we have no ability to choose freely which action we will perform from among a range of alternatives, then we hardly need a code, a moral code, to tell us how to choose actions from a range of alternatives. If we're not morally responsible for our actions, then we can hardly be blamed for them or praised for them in moral terms. If we have no choice about the goals that we pursue, then we don't need a code of values to tell us what goals to pursue. So ethics is the primary reason that the issue of free will is so important. But today I'm going to focus on free will from a somewhat different perspective. Actually, my two lectures together are going to take a somewhat different perspective on the question. For a number of years I've been interested in what in philosophy is called the mind-body problem. As you know, in objectivism, the mind-body dichotomy is an important part of Ayn Rand's analysis for a number of philosophical trends that she opposes, such as Platonic idealism, the idea of Platonic love versus sex, or of art versus entertainment. All of these represent or theory versus practice. All of these represent a dichotomy between the mind and the body. But in philosophy, the mind-body problem has a somewhat narrower focus. It means it's a question of what the relation is between the mind, consciousness, and the physical basis for consciousness, the brain in particular. And a little more broadly, it's the question of what is the place of the mind in nature. How is it that nature exhibits such a phenomenon as consciousness, thinking, the mind? That's the context in which I'm going to approach the question of free will. You know, it's often said that free will may seem plausible to us from the inside when we reflect, when we introspect on the way our minds work, but that we have to abandon the idea of free will when we look at ourselves from the outside as beings in nature subject to nature's law. This is the idea that free will is not compatible with a scientific orientation, that it's a relic of a religious outlook, a product of wishful thinking, the kind of thing only a soft-headed person in the humanities could believe. It's the idea that someday when we know more about how the brain works, we'll look back on the idea of free will the way we now look back on the idea that the stars move on crystalline spheres pushed along by angels. I think this idea is completely false. The more I think about the biological role of consciousness, and man's form of consciousness in particular, and the more I learn about the way the brain functions, the more natural it seems to me that we have free choice. The more clearly it seems to me free will fits perfectly into a coherent scientific view of nature. So that's my focus in these two lectures. Today, however, we have to start by laying out some fundamentals. And this is going to mean covering some ground that I think some of you are probably basically familiar with. In today's lecture, I want to cover three basic topics. First of all, we need to formulate the issue precisely. We need to find out what it is exactly that determinists say and what it is that a free will theory says. Secondly, I want to go over Ayn Rand's theory of free will, which holds that the essential free will choice is the choice to focus, the choice to think. Thirdly and finally, I want to raise the problem of causality, the alleged contradiction between free will and causality, the idea that the existence of volition would violate the law of causality. I'll state that in general, and then that will be our platform for going into more detail next time. So let me begin by formulating the issue. And I need to start with a few comments on the concept of choice. Now, we all know in our lives that we face choice. We face alternatives. We do this all the time. We choose whether to go to a certain school or college versus another one. We choose which job to accept. We face decisions as to whether to leave a job. We face decisions in our personal relationships, whether to continue a relationship or to end it, whether to start one. We choose whether to go out on Saturday night or to stay home. This is obviously a real phenomenon. We all know, if we look inside our minds, that there are occasions when we say, I could do this or I could do that. And we think about which one to do. No one could deny that that phenomenon occurs. Even a determinist who says that the outcome is preordained by a whole set of factors still has to recognize that phenomenon of deliberation and choice. So today, when I use the term choice, I want to use it in a neutral sense, not as implying volition, okay, and therefore as something, as a term that the determinist can use to refer to a real psychological phenomenon. When I want to refer specifically to choice regarded as free, I will talk about a free choice or about volition. Okay, I need to make this terminological point for reasons we'll get to in a minute when I define determinism and free will. All right, what is determinism? Determinists say that at any given moment, there is only one action an individual can take. And that action is determined by the sum total of causes operating on the individual up to that point in time. That sum total of causes may include his personality, his beliefs, values, physical condition, his genes, his parents, his education, his physical and social environment. A determinist says that your mental processes, your cognitive processes, all function like perception. There may be a train of conscious thoughts going through your mind, but the product is inexorably determined by causal factors in just the way that perception is, and is therefore, in a sense, automatic. You have no choice. In the same way, a determinist says that your actions are inexorably determined in the same way that a reflex is. Again, in an action, there may be a sequence of considerations and feelings and desires that lie between some stimulus and some response, but the link between them is as fully necessitated as it is in the case of the knee-jerk reflex when the doctor strikes your knee. You are no more in control of what you feel, what you want, what you do, than you are in control of your knee when it jerks. So we can define determinism as the view that all actions, thoughts, and choices are necessitated by antecedent factors. And that's the definition that I've put down on the handout. I should make sure, by the way, that you all have a copy of this to follow along. Okay, if you don't, there must be copies in the back. Okay. Determinism is the thesis that all actions, thoughts, and choices are necessitated by antecedent factors. And these antecedent factors, of course, are themselves the effects of prior causes, which are the effects of prior causes going back in time. Ultimately, the whole sequence is outside of our control. That's determinism. What about free will? Well, a free will theory holds the opposite position. If you've studied Aristotelian logic, it's the exact contradictory position. Free will says that some action or choice or thought is not necessitated by antecedent factors. Some actions, perhaps not all, but at least some, are under direct volitional control. In regard to these actions, we face genuine alternatives. At that particular moment, there is more than one action possible to us in the next instant. Okay? The sum total of causes operating at a given moment leaves an individual with more than one alternative, and when someone makes a choice and performs an action, we can say he could have done otherwise. He could have acted in some other way. Now, these are general definitions. They state the principles that all determinists, on the one hand, and all free will theories, on the other hand, would agree about. But within each camp, there are various different versions of each general thesis. And just to give you an idea of the range of possibility here, I want to say something about the varieties of determinist theory and the varieties of free will theory. Determinists agree that all actions are necessitated by antecedent factors. So, an obvious next question is, which ones? Which factors, which type of factor is the most important? And we can classify determinists by the way that they answer that question. So let me go over briefly 3 different categories of determinist viewpoints. I call them environmental, psychological, and physiological determinism. Environmental determinism says that the primary determinants of action are causes in the external environment, particularly the social environment. This view says that man's nature is essentially plastic. We are malleable. We have an innate nature that is susceptible to complete influence and domination by forces acting on us. Okay, now the best known example of this kind of determinism would be probably behaviorism, the psychological theories associated with B.F. Skinner. Skinner says that what we do is the result of the way we've been conditioned throughout the whole course of our lives. Throughout our lives, we've been rewarded for some actions by parents, by our teachers, employers, friends, etc. And we've been punished for others. That is, we've acted and we've had a negative consequence. Our actions then reflect the sum of these external influences. We tend to act in a way that is consistent with the history of our conditioning. Another influential version of environmental determinism is Marx's view. Marx held, as you know, that the entire realm of personality, what he called the realm of consciousness, including ideas, values, feelings, all of that is a causal byproduct of the real underlying forces which are economic, such as the mode of production, the class system of a society, the distribution of property. That's what moves history, because that's what moves people. And people's individual thoughts are simply byproducts. They are epiphenomena, things like steam thrown off by the steam engine that does no further work. Marx often said consciousness is a social product. Okay, and in one form or another, this view is very common to people on the political left. Virtually in fact, from liberals on left, there's almost always some tendrils of a theory of environmental determinism at work. As you can see most clearly if you look at their theories of crime. All right, psychological determinism says that the primary determinants of action are internal psychological factors such as thoughts, feelings, and desires. These come together in a certain way, and we tend to act on the basis of our strongest desire, about which we have no choice. It's particularly clear in the case of Freud's theory, which is perhaps the best known version of psychological determinism, that it has to be deterministic because Freud holds that the conscious thoughts, feelings are products of subconscious factors over which, of course, we have no control. As one expositor liked to put it, for Freud, the conscious mind is a mouthpiece for the subconscious. Okay, and finally, physiological determinism holds that the primary determinants of action are neural events in the brain. These are physical events, the firing of individual cells, circuits and feedback loops and everything else that goes on within clusters of cells, cell assemblies in the brain. The flow of electrical impulses through the brain and the electrical fields that are generated by the combined action of nerve cells. All of these physical events are what govern action. This view also holds that consciousness as such is an epiphenomenon. Something thrown off, perhaps, by neural activity, but not itself doing any further work, not giving us any kind of control over the stuff going on in our brain. And in fact, some people who hold this view hold that consciousness is an illusion. There just isn't any such thing. I find it impossible to take this view seriously, since I don't know how there could be an illusion if there's no consciousness, to be deceived about it. But nevertheless, this is, I would say, is the most common view among philosophers today in the area of philosophy of mind, at least in British and American philosophy. Okay, those are versions of determinism. What about free will? Well, free will says that some actions, choices, and thoughts are not necessitated by antecedent factors. They're under direct volitional control. So the key question here is, which choice, which action, which thought is under direct volitional control? Okay? And we can classify theories of free will on the basis of how they answer that question. Now, in the extreme case, existentialism, at least in the form presented by Jean-Paul Sartre, says that we have total control. At any given moment, we can choose our actions, our emotions, our personality, our values, our goals. In short, for Sartre, the entire mental realm is volitional. There's no causal relation between one moment and the next. There is no causal relation between one mental state and another. Now, the basis for this view is an elaborate theory on Sartre's part, which I'm not going to try to recapitulate, to the effect that consciousness, in a sense, cannot have an identity. It's not like objects in nature. It's radically divorced from anything that you find in nature. It does not have a nature, and therefore cannot be subject to causal constraints. Needless to say, this is not the objectivist position. Most free will theories don't try to exempt consciousness from causality. They acknowledge that at any given moment, one does not have direct volitional control over all the contents and processes in one's mind. The question is, in what specific areas of mental functioning do we find volition? Objectivism belongs to a school of thought that locates volition in the area of attention, in the direction of the mind to specific contents. We are capable of self-awareness, we're capable of monitoring the contents of our minds, and we select the contents, the thoughts and the feelings, that we attend to, and the degree of attention that we pay to them. That's the basic choice. That's the realm over which we have direct volitional control. Okay? By means of making those kinds of choices, we have indirect control over our actions, because our actions flow from the contents of our consciousness. Our actions flow from the products of our thought. And in the long run, we also have control over the basic premises and values that we accept and incorporate into our hierarchy of values, our character, our personality. Those too are the products of thinking, but over a much longer time frame. So by making such choices, the choice to think, we do have indirect control over our values and feelings, our personality as well. But the primary choice is the choice to think. All of the other control that we have over our minds and our actions trace back to that one. Let me give you Ayn Rand's summary of her view from her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. I quote, Man's particular distinction from all other living species is the fact that his consciousness is volitional. Reason is the faculty that perceives, identifies, and integrates the material provided by man's senses. It is a faculty that man has to exercise by choice. Thinking is not an automatic function. In any hour and issue of his life, man is free to think or to evade that effort. Thinking requires a state of full, focused awareness. The act of focusing one's consciousness is volitional. Man can focus his mind to a full, active, purposefully directed awareness of reality, or he can unfocus it and let himself drift in a semi-conscious daze. End quote. Now, it's clear that the central concept here is the concept of focusing one's mind. The essence of free will is the choice to focus. So let's start with the question, what does that mean? Let's look a little more closely at this act of focusing. And I want to start with an analogy to a phenomenon at the perceptual level. Let's call it perceptual attention. Suppose you're alone at night in your home. You're reading a book. You're dimly aware of your surroundings, the furniture around you, the customary noises from the street, or if you live in the country, as I do, the crickets chirping and birds, etc. The feel of the chair and the feel of the book in your hands, and you're dimly aware of the visual layout of objects around you. But you're only dimly aware of all that because you're focused on the book. You're absorbed in what you're reading. And then you hear a scratching noise at the door. Like that. Now, if you're anything like me, this would have an effect on your perceptual awareness. Your attention would be drawn to this sound. But in addition, and more importantly, the level or intensity of your perceptual awareness would go up. Okay? You would not be dimly aware of that sound. You would not remain dimly aware of that sound. Your attention would be riveted on it. Your senses would go on red alert, sensitive to every nuance and aspect of that sound. Of course, now your mind would be racing too. Your mind would be racing, thinking, what is it? Is it my dog? Is it the neighbor? Is it Anthony Perkins? You know, like from Psycho? Since I'm making up the example and I'm believing in the benevolent universe, let's say it's your dog. But leave that aside. I'm not concerned with your conceptual functioning, your thinking. I'm just concentrate on your attention here. It's clear that something would happen to the character of your perceptual awareness. Okay, if we think of the perceptual awareness as a kind of spotlight, then two things have happened here. One, the spotlight is turned to a new item in your environment, but also the level or intensity of the light has gone up. You've turned up the wattage on the light. Okay? Awareness is always awareness of something, but that relationship comes in degrees. You can be more or less fully and clearly aware of it. Okay, now the act of focusing one's mind is analogous. Focusing one's mind means raising the level of one's awareness. Focus is to the conceptual level what the phenomenon I just described is to the perceptual level. Okay? However, there's a tremendous difference between the perceptual level and the conceptual level. The perceptual level is the ground floor of human awareness. It's the given. It's direct. It's automatic. It's effortless. So at the perceptual level, it's especially easy to see this variation that I'm talking about, and that's why I used it as an analogy. But the conceptual level is not given. It's not direct. It's not automatic. It's not effortless. Conceptual awareness, like perceptual, means the grasp of reality. But we have to achieve that grasp by means of a conscious process. Conceptual awareness, like perceptual, comes in degrees, and the act of focusing is the act of raising that degree of awareness. But to understand what that means, we have to understand something about the nature of the conscious processes involved in conceptual awareness. Now, in this respect, if I may digress for a moment, I think this is one of the signal advances of Ayn Rand's theory of free will over any predecessor. As I indicated before, she is not the first philosopher or thinker to suspect that free will had something to do with attention. But most other philosophers just left the matter there. Ayn Rand went on to identify the choice to devote attention and raise the degree of attention as the choice to think, as the choice to exercise one's conceptual faculty. She then went on to integrate that very tightly with her ethics, in which the primary virtue is rationality, choosing to think. And all of her ethics then, all the virtues are simply amplifications of that. And on the other hand, in epistemology, she didn't just say the choice to focus is the choice to think. She went on and developed an entire epistemological theory about what it means to think, what the conceptual level is. And in a sense, if I were to try to explain to you fully and completely what's involved in the choice to think, I would have to review the entire objectivist epistemology, from concept formation to induction to certainty and everything else, which of course I can't do here today. I can try to summarize the point so that we understand what you're choosing when you choose to focus by bringing the relevant aspects of this choice under two broad headings or categories: integration and objectivity. Integration and objectivity. And we'll start with integration. All thinking, all human conceptual functioning involves the identification of relationships, ultimately relationships between perceptual concretes. In one form or another, that's what we're doing when we think. And the identification of those relationships is what I mean in the broadest and most fundamental sense by the term integration. When you see an animal in a zoo and you recognize, well, in a farm, let's say, and you recognize it as a horse, what you're doing is relating that animal to a certain class of other animals that you have identified and subsumed under a concept, horse. To form that concept in the first place, what you had to do was to bring together, notice that certain animals had certain similarities, and that they differed in certain ways from other animals. Similarity and difference are relationships. You put them together on the basis of similarity to form the concept, and a new mental unit emerged in that process, namely the concept horse. So our thought is always either engaged in forming new mental units on the basis of relationships that we perceive in reality, or it's taking those mental units and assimilating new concretes to them, identifying new objects as instances of a concept or of a general principle. Every operation of conceptual thought, from classification to reasoning to explanation, involves the awareness of relationships among objects in reality, similarity and difference, cause and effect, genus and species, premise and conclusion, etc. So in that respect, being in focus means acting on the policy of integrating, acting on a commitment to integrate. It means not treating every object as a self-contained unit, as something detached from any context, but comparing and contrasting, noticing its similarities and differences with other things, identifying its causes, integrating it into a single, unified framework of knowledge. For example, suppose you're in a history class in college, and the professor is talking about how the industrialists of the late 19th century were robber barons. All right. Yesterday in your economics class, the topic was how entrepreneurs exploit workers. The day before that, the political science teacher was going on about how wealthy businessmen corrupt politicians and have legislation written to suit their purposes. Now, you could treat each of these as an isolated instance. Take each assertion at face value and leave it at that. And I'm afraid that's how a great many students function. Or you could integrate them. You could say, don't these different views have something in common? Isn't there some kind of common doctrine that I'm being indoctrinated by? Or suppose I'm feeling an emotion, okay, and I want to identify it. Now, at a fairly low level of integration, I might say my thought process might amount to something like this. I'm feeling kind of down. I've got like the blahs. That might be my first step toward identifying it. It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't go very far. At a higher level of integration and precision, I would have to ask, what exactly am I feeling? Is it sadness? Then what am I sad about? What specific thing? Or am I depressed in general? And if so, what might have put me in that kind of mood? Or am I just tired? Okay? So in that respect, choosing to focus means taking an integrative approach to knowledge. Okay? A non-passive approach. It means taking charge, operating on the mental policy of identifying new objects and new concretes in conceptual terms, assimilating them into the context of knowledge that you already have, and expanding that context by being on the lookout for new patterns, wider integrations, finer distinctions. Okay, so the choice to focus then is first, and I would say foremost, the choice to integrate, to put two and two together. Let's turn now to objectivity, the second major heading. Perceptual awareness by its very nature is in contact with reality. It results from the interaction of external objects with our sense organs, and there's no such thing as a false or invalid percept. There are degrees of awareness, as in our example, but even dim awareness is still awareness. At the conceptual level, however, our conclusions are not produced in that way. They're not automatically true or valid. They result from integrative processes that are subject to error. When we classify things, it's possible for us to do it on the basis of non-essential similarities and end up with an invalid concept as a result. The history of philosophy is riddled with these things. When we draw conclusions from premises, when we weigh the evidence for and against a given statement, we can commit errors of logic. Any conclusion we reach, any piece of conceptual knowledge that we have, is only as good as the process by which it was reached, and that process is subject to error. We can make mistakes, we can overlook relevant information, we can be affected by bias or emotion. To be in focus, then, it's not enough that we commit ourselves to the policy of integrating. We have to take responsibility for the accuracy and objectivity of that process. We have to take responsibility for checking the steps by which we arrived at a conclusion, for making sure that we've taken account of all the relevant evidence, and that we've excluded any irrelevant considerations that might otherwise have affected our judgment. So in this context, focus means a commitment to objectivity. Raising the level of one's conceptual awareness means raising the accuracy and the commitment to accuracy in your thought processes. Okay? It means proceeding, to commitment to proceed on the basis of the facts and only the facts. Okay. Being out of focus, by contrast, would mean operating haphazardly, jumping to conclusions, letting emotion sway your judgment, ignoring facts that are unpleasant or threatening, failing to re-examine a conclusion in light of new evidence, adopting one explanation for something without considering any alternatives, looking only at one piece of the picture and ignoring the full context. All of these violate the principles of method that keep our conclusions in contact with reality. They undercut our grasp of reality. So choosing to think, to be aware of reality, means being objective. So to summarize, the choice to focus or not is the choice to seek and maintain awareness of reality at the conceptual level, the level that's appropriate to a human mind. And awareness of reality at that level requires a process of integration and a commitment to objectivity. Now, I want to emphasize that people differ in their intellectual skills, in their ability to integrate and to evaluate the process by which they reach conclusions. How far you can go in integrating depends on how much knowledge you have in a given area and what thinking skills you've acquired. In our example above, the person who identified his feeling just as, well, I'm feeling kind of down, that might be as far as someone could get if he hadn't developed his introspective skills any further. And the same with objectivity. We're not born knowing the laws of logic. We have to learn them. We have to make them automatic through practice. And here again, people differ in their abilities. So, and this degree of skill is not subject to volitional choice, not at a given instant, although over the long term we choose how far we want to go. So what is subject to volition and what's meant by the choice to focus is the choice to use what you've got. It means a commitment to the policy of integration and objectivity, using the best approach and all the skills that you have. We should also recognize that focus comes in degrees. At one extreme would be a state of complete passivity. To take in the case of the emotion, being completely out of focus would mean just being immersed in the feeling and drifting with it without any effort whatever to identify what's going on. Okay. And finally, one last point. Focus is not the same thing as concentration. This is an important distinction. Concentration is a state of attending to some specific mental content to the exclusion of everything else, as in solving a problem or reading a book or whatever it might be. Concentration implies a high level of focus, but you can be in focus without concentrating. You can be relaxing, taking a walk, doing any number of things. At the extreme, I would say you can even daydream in focus. In fact, that can be a very important part of the creative process, letting your subconscious run more or less free for a while, but you have to stay in focus to observe what comes out of it. Okay, this is particularly important to me because that's how I write. I don't mean I'm out of focus. I mean, I'm daydreaming all the time, but certain key steps occur in that context. All right, now so far I've been talking about the level of focus as an overall state of mind, regardless of what specific things we're thinking about. I've been talking about the level of intensity of one's mental spotlight, regardless of where that spotlight is directed. If we choose to operate at a lower level of focus, the intensity goes down across the board, no matter what we happen to be thinking about. But it's also possible for us to go out of focus in regard to a specific content, to evade a specific fact or feeling or issue. Going out of focus in general means ceasing to put forth a certain effort to focus the mind. But evasion means actively pushing something out of mind, usually because it's threatening in some way. The classic example outside Ayn Rand's own works of this is Scarlett O'Hara, who dealt with unpleasant facts by saying, well, I'll think about that tomorrow. And of course what she meant was, since tomorrow in that sense never came, what she meant was, I won't think about it. It won't be there if I don't think about it. Now, in order to evade something, it has to be present to consciousness in some form, usually as a dim awareness, which we push back into the darkness instead of bringing out into full awareness. For example, I'm driving along in my car and I run out of gas. Okay? This is frustrating. I'd like to have someone to be angry at. My wife is a likely candidate. And so I start feeling, why didn't she tell me the tank was empty? Why didn't she fill the tank? And I have the satisfaction of not being at fault myself for what was a stupid action. And it's very satisfying. But unless I am completely out of control, the thought is going to occur to me at some point, wait a minute, why did she have to fill the tank? Why did she have to tell me about the gas gauge when I can look at it myself? I have, visual contact with reality. It's right there. And at this point, I have a choice. I can take that dim awareness, that nagging thought in the back of my mind of being unfair to her, and I can say, well, yeah, that's true. I'm being silly, and the anger goes away because I focus on the injustice of what I was starting to do. Or I can just push that out and say, no, I want to be angry now. And this thought is getting in the way of that, so goodbye. Now, sometimes evasion does not involve pushing something out of consciousness entirely, but only keeping it at a sufficiently low level of awareness that we are not aware of its implications or its full meaning for what we're doing. This happens, for example, when we evaluate people. Someone does something, someone we like, for example, does something shady or hurtful or whatever, and we can hardly ignore the act. But we can keep it at a sufficiently low level of focus that we don't think about what that might mean about this person or our relationship with them. Or conversely, if there's someone you don't like who does something good, which can be extremely irritating, you might say, well, that wasn't that good an insight, or that was probably a bad motive behind it, or just let it hover there with some vague rationalization surrounding it so that you don't have to appreciate its implications. Okay? And of course, we often, especially when feelings are running high, can evade the need to be objective. We have a dim inkling somewhere in our mind that what we're doing, we're moving along, we're jumping to conclusions, we're engaged in shoddy epistemological practice, and we better stop and check it out. But we say, well, no, I like this conclusion when I got to, and I've got lots of evidence in it. I won't worry about it. Okay, now, I hope it's clear now, at least in a broad way, what we mean by the choice to focus, the choice to think. I've tried to isolate a particular specific mental action that we perform, extracting it from the flow of other actions that occur in our minds, from the flow of thoughts and feelings and desires, from the so-called stream of consciousness. There's this one specific act, which is focusing. But now, having isolated it, we need to put it back into its context and see how the choice to focus affects the psychological processes involved in acting. Okay? We want to see how the choice to focus gives us control over our actions when we have to make a decision in reality and take some existential action. And I think the best way to do this, because it's an enormous subject, is to take an example, a sufficiently rich example that we can see the many, at least get a feel for some of the issues here. And the example I've chosen is from Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead, the example of Rourke's decision to turn down the assignment to do the bank building. I believe it was called the Manhattan Bank Company building. As you remember in The Fountainhead, just to give you a little context, Rourke, this is at a stage where Rourke had just opened his architectural office. He'd done, I think, one office building or department store and a few houses, but his business had not started. In fact, he was running out of money and was facing the need to, a situation where he was going to have to close down his office. And at that point, a director for this bank company who had seen one of his houses and liked it, came to him and said he'd talked the board of directors into letting Rourke submit a plan, which he does, and now he's waiting to hear. He finally hears that the board has accepted his plan. They've chosen him as the architect for the building, but there's one condition. He has to accept the classical motif on the building. He had designed it according to his own architectural standards, including his standards of ornament, facades, and so forth. They wanted a classical motif to appease the traditionalists. And Rourke tries to explain to them why that would destroy the integrity of the building, why it would ruin it. But the board's decision was final, and Rourke has to take it or leave it. Okay. And now from the novel. "You understand the situation, Mr. Rourke?" says the chairman of the bank. "Yes," said Rourke. His eyes were lowered. He was looking down at the drawings. "Well?" Rourke did not answer. "Yes or no, Mr. Rourke?" Rourke's head leaned back. He closed his eyes. "No," said Rourke. Now this is a portrait of a man making a decision in reality. He's clearly faced with this, what's going on inside his mind is an example of what I described at the outset, of choice. He's thinking about the alternatives. We see him from the outside, but let's try to read between the lines and think about what's going through his mind. He's got a clear-cut decision to make, and his choice, whichever one he makes, is going to be based on his values and on his judgment about what will best serve those values. On the one hand, he has a very powerful motive for accepting the commission. This is a bigger project than anything he's done, and it's going to advance his career if he does it. He's at the end of his money, so turning down this commission is going to mean closing his office and leaving architecture for he doesn't know how long. He's passionately committed to his work. Saying no is going to mean abandoning for he doesn't know how long the thing that he loves most. On the other hand, his belief in the integrity of a building's design and appearance is absolutely essential to his love for architecture. He builds in order to bring that value into existence. Putting up a flawed, compromised building would not serve that purpose. So he also has a powerful motive for turning down the commission. So either way, he's got a motive for accepting and a motive for rejecting the bank's deal. If he accepts it, that action will be caused by one set of values and beliefs. Okay? The value of his career to him and the recognition that this would be a step forward. If he rejects it, that action too will be caused by another set of values and beliefs. The value of integrity and the recognition that the building is flawed. Moreover, just to enlarge the picture, those motives that are there present at the moment in Rourke's mind, those motives are the product of his character, his values, his knowledge, his principles. Okay? At the moment we see him making the choice, these are not subject to his direct volition. They are products of choices he's made over the entire course of his life. The feelings that are passing through his mind, his desire to get the commission, his anguish at the thought of losing it, and even worse at the thought of leaving architecture, his disgust for this compromised design, the disappointment and contempt and anger that he must feel at the men who want him to produce this thing, this monstrosity. These emotions would be automatic responses based on his values. So where does free will occur in this event, in this decision? Well, it occurs in his choice as to which set of causes will govern his action. His action could potentially be caused by two different sets of motives. The choice is, in effect, which ones are going to govern his action. And he makes that choice by exercising his capacity to focus. Because he chose to stay in focus, he realized that putting up a building without integrity would not in fact satisfy his desire to build. It would represent an inversion of his hierarchy of values. What's at issue here? What's at issue is whether he's going to be able to get the commission, do the plans, oversee the construction, make some money, all the things that are involved in putting up a building. But for Rourke, those are only means to his fundamental goal, which is to embody an architectural vision in reality. Accepting the commission would be elevating the means over the end. And by choosing to stay in focus, he realizes that. He must also realize that whatever advantage it would give his career in the short run to do this building, whatever prestige he might earn, it would not be a step forward in the long run. The building would stand as a constant reproach to himself and a constant reminder to others and a warning that Rourke does not stand by the principles that he espouses. So in the long run, it would not help his career. But that too is a fact that he acts on only because he chooses to keep it in focus. Because he focuses on these facts, the motive that would otherwise cause him to accept the commission is renounced. It's disconnected. It has no causal efficacy over his action. It's detached as if he had shifted a gear lever, and those particular motives can no longer drive his wheels. His action is governed instead by the considerations that he has chosen to keep in focus. But he could have evaded those considerations. He could have put the long run out of his mind and dwelled only on the short run. He could have evaded his principles of integrity and his hierarchy of values and let his mind be dominated solely by the anguish at the thought of losing the project. Or he could have recognized that this would be compromised his integrity, but he could have rationalized it away. He could have thought, well, the building won't be perfect, but it'll be pretty good, and next time I can do it my way. Now, the same basic pattern is involved in any voluntary choice, voluntary action. There's always some motivation behind an action, and with hindsight, looking back, we can trace the action back to some specific set of some specific motivation, which would include a set of feelings and desires and beliefs. And we can trace those in turn back to a person's values and choices he's made through the whole course of his life. So in general, it's valid to say that actions are caused by the contents of our mind, but the choice to focus gives us control over the contents of our mind. By choosing the degree to which we seek conceptual level awareness of reality, by choosing whether to identify or evade specific facts, we choose the particular contents that are going to govern our actions. Okay, so I'm running a little behind, and I don't want to elaborate any further on the issue of how the choice to focus governs action. We can turn more to that in the question period if you like. I want to turn now to the validation of the free will theory. What I've been describing so far is simply a description. I'm giving you a description of what occurs in the mind, but a determinist could accept everything I've said so far and simply say, well, the choice to focus is necessitated by antecedent factors. Okay, so we need to ask, what's wrong with that position? Okay, how do I know that the determinist is wrong? Well, I'm going to proceed very quickly now. And in a sense, I feel entitled to it because I think he is self-evidently wrong. The basis for knowing that we have free will, that we are volitional beings, is our own capacity to observe volition in our minds. The existence of volition can be established by direct observation, introspective observation of the way our minds work. And once we've isolated the action of focusing the mind, we can see that the choice to focus is up to us. We can observe that we are in control. We observe that focusing takes a certain effort. It's possible for us to exert that effort, and it's possible for us to withhold the effort. Either way, it won't just happen. If I'm out of focus, just drifting along out of control, you can yell at me all you want. I can yell at myself. You know, come on, wake up and smell a coffee. Focus, get a grip on yourself. But I can also, no matter how much I do that, I can tune out that little voice in my mind, or I can tune you out even more easily, and choose not to take account of the considerations that make it reasonable for me to choose to focus in that context. Determinists would say that the choice is necessitated by antecedent factors. But when I'm in focus, they say there's a motive. I want to understand something. And I realize that I have to be in focus in order to understand. But that motive is itself something that I could evade. The desire to understand something will lead me to focus only if I hold in mind and focus on the fact that understanding requires focus, requires integration and objectivity. I could evade that fact. I could try to have knowledge without causes, knowledge without effort. A large number of people spend a large part of their lives trying just that. There are all kinds of get smart schemes, analogous to the get rich schemes that flourish. In the same way, a determinist would say that when I go out of focus or evade, there's also a motive. I resent the effort it would take to focus, or some fact is too unpleasant for me to deal with. But in that case, I'm going to be aware, however dimly, that I'm not going to get anywhere without exerting the effort, or I'm going to be aware dimly that the fact won't go away just because I push it out of my mind. I can choose whether to make that dim awareness more fully real, or to suppress it and put the awareness out of mind. So I believe it is self-evident that the choice to focus is a free one, and this fact is so fundamental that it is inescapable. Even a determinist who tries to deny it will implicitly rely on this fact. So it's not only self-evident, it's fundamental to an extent that it is inescapable. Why? Well, a determinist who denies the existence of free choice is offering his position as something he knows to be true. By his own theory, however, it must also be something he was causally determined to believe. To be consistent, he must regard his own belief in determinism as something necessitated by antecedent factors. And there's a contradiction here. If he regards himself as knowing that determinism is true, he must believe that he arrived at his position on the basis of evidence and proof, and not on the basis of some irrational motive, such as the desire to escape responsibility for his actions. He has to admit that such irrational functioning is possible to him. He's not infallible. But his own theory says it was not up to him whether he would proceed on a rational or an irrational basis. He had no choice as to whether he would be objective in his thinking about the issue of determinism. In short, he is saying that his belief in determinism is based on the evidence, that's how he knows it, but he's also saying that he has no control over whether any of his beliefs are based on evidence. Moreover, a determinist is trying to persuade us to accept his position. He thinks that anyone who believes in free will is mistaken, that free will is a soft-headed piece of wishful thinking which we should grow up and get over. And he wants to persuade us to stop indulging this kind of wishful thinking, to wake up and focus on the facts that make determinism true. But all that presupposes that we can choose to be objective. That objectivity is up to us. If we have no choice in the matter, then it would be irrelevant for the determinist to give us arguments, to offer evidence for his position, since neither he nor his opponents have any choice, free choice, as to whether they're going to proceed on the basis of evidence or on the basis of subjective emotion or desire or the conventional beliefs of their society or whatever. So, to weigh the evidence for or against any position, we must do it in accordance with standards of logic and proof. And the use of standards in epistemology presupposes choice, free choice, in just the same way and for the same reason that the use of standards in ethics presupposes free choice. The existence of volition is therefore an axiom, or it is axiomatic. It lies at the base of any proof, any conceptual level knowledge. So on the one hand, we can't prove it, because any proof would presuppose it, but on the other hand, it doesn't need proof, it's self-evident and inescapable. Okay, now I'm going to try to leave some time for questions, because I know people have a lot of questions about free will. I'm sure some of you will have questions about the argument that I just gave. But I want to go on and at least introduce the final topic for today, which is free will and causality. And I will try to keep this to 5 or 10 minutes. I would say that the chief objection to free will, the chief philosophical reason why people deny free will, there are many psychological reasons, but the chief philosophical reason is the view that volition would violate the law of causality. The law of causality says that an entity's actions are determined by its nature. Actions do not occur at random. We don't live in a world of flux where things just happen without cause, unpredictably. There is no slippage or free play in nature. Right? Things are governed by causes. The action of an entity is produced by its nature and the way it responds, given that nature, to external circumstances. And the same cause must have the same effect. Two identical things and identical circumstances must act in the same way. Now, determinists argue that volition would violate that principle. When a person acts, and this includes the act of focusing his mind, he is acting in some particular set of circumstances, and he has a particular nature or identity. Both the circumstances and his nature are antecedent factors. They don't spring into being at the moment of choice. If the choice is not necessitated by antecedent factors, then how can we say it has a cause? And if the act of focusing does not have a cause, then it would be random and unpredictable. It would be something that just happens, in which case we are not in control of it. Okay, so there's a dilemma here. If the act of focusing is necessitated by antecedent factors, then we're not in control of it. If it is not necessitated by antecedent factors, then it doesn't have a cause, and we're not in control of it either. It just happens. Sometimes I'm in focus, and sometimes I'm not, but I'm not in any control over it. So there's, either way, we are not in control of the act of focusing. Now, this is an objection. This is an argument that we need to be able to answer. We can't dismiss the law of causality. The law of causality is itself axiomatic. It has the same level of fundamentality in human knowledge as the existence of free will. So we're faced with a situation where there's an apparent conflict between two fundamental bases of our knowledge. That's not acceptable. If a thing, so we have to see what's wrong in the determinist assumption that for an action to have a cause, it must be necessitated by antecedent factors. In other words, we have to see what's wrong in the way determinists apply the law of causality to the example, or the specific concrete of the act of focusing. And in this respect, the point I want to conclude on today is to deal with what I think is one essential part of the problem. In fact, it's really the essence of it. And this is the item on the handout, Hume versus Aristotle. It is a conflict between, it's a question of choosing the appropriate view of causality, about the nature of causality. Part of the reason for the determinist argument that I summarized before is the view that causality is a relationship between events. Okay? An event at one moment causes an event at the next moment. This view derives from David Hume, although he had predecessors in it, but he's the one who emphasized it. And it's held by many scientists and philosophers today. It's certainly the most common view. This is sometimes called the billiard ball theory of causality, because the classical example is billiards. You strike the cue ball rolls and hits the object ball rolls off, a sequence of events, each causing the next. On this theory, by definition, the only way for an action to have a cause is for it to be caused by prior events, because that's what causes are, events. So the only way for an action to have a cause would be for it to be necessitated by antecedent factors, and determinism would have to be true. Now, objectivism rejects that view of causality in favor of a view that's associated with Aristotle. Not everything I'm going to say is something Aristotle himself said, but this is in the Aristotelian tradition and spirit. On this view, events per se are not causes. An event is an action of an entity, or the combined actions of a set of entities. So an event is never a cause, it's always an effect. Events, actions are not their own causes, and they don't cause other actions. Entities cause actions, because it's entities that act. The cause of actions is always the entity or the entities which act. So when you focus your mind, the act certainly does have a cause, regardless of whether it's voluntary or not. The cause is the entity which acts, namely you. You are the agent. You are the entity acting in that context. The act of focus is your act. You make it happen. It's not a free-floating occurrence. So it certainly has a cause. But there's a second and equally important point. Hume's view of causality tends to put all the emphasis on the external circumstances in which an entity acts. Okay? The forces that are acting on the object, the way it is affected by other objects, the way it responds to its environment. Hume and his followers, in other words, tend to treat all causality as being of the billiard ball type. And I should say that even in the case of the billiard balls, the Aristotelian theory says it's the billiard balls that are causing the action in accordance with their nature. Okay. But Aristotle noted that external factors, the forces acting on an object, are only one factor involved in causing it to act the way it does. Okay. And they're not the most important factor. Since an entity is the cause of its actions, the most important factor is the nature of the entity itself, the identity of the thing which acts. This might include its matter, what Aristotle called the material cause. It includes the form in which that matter is organized, the internal structure, set of relations that the components exhibit when they form that structure. It includes the properties and the potentialities of the object. It includes its entire identity. It is that identity in conjunction with the external circumstances that explains the way the entity acts. The entity acts in accordance with its nature, and its nature determines the way it will respond to external circumstances. It will determine which external influences can affect the object and which not. I mean, for example, the price of eggs in Providence is an external factor governing present in the context of a hen laying an egg in Providence. But the hen is not responding to the price of eggs in Providence. It is not saying, well, demand's up, I'm going to take advantage of this. This is not something hens respond to because their nature doesn't permit it. Okay, what this view allows is a much more sophisticated view of causality than the billiard ball type. The Aristotelian view, which says that causality is a matter of the nature or identity of the objects which act, allows Aristotle or an Aristotelian to recognize that there may be many different modes of causality in nature, that there may be many different types of specific relationships between the nature of an entity and the external circumstances that it acts in. Okay? And in fact, I will argue now in brief and elaborate in more detail next time. I think this is exactly what we observe in nature. To anticipate a little bit, inanimate objects like billiard balls respond in an essentially passive way to the forces acting on them. Living organisms, such as plants, are goal-directed. The source of their actions comes from within, in a sense that I'll try to define next time. Animals, going a step further, animals act on the basis of conscious awareness and desires. They exhibit psychological causation. And one aspect of this is that the locus of control over the act has moved still further inward. And man finally has the ability to reason, to introspect, to focus on his awareness. It's natural to see that as the culmination of this trend toward increasingly internal control over action. And if our nature gives us complete control, if our nature makes it possible for us to focus freely by exercising the capacity to focus, that would not violate the law of causality. In exercising the choice freely, we would be acting completely in accordance with our nature. Volition then would not violate the law of causality. It would be an instance of the law of causality. It would be an instance of an entity acting in accordance with its nature. Now, I believe that what I have just given you is a philosophical answer to the problem of causality, or the objection that free will would violate causality. And as a philosophical answer, I think it's adequate. But next time, I want to elaborate more fully on this. I want to take the little sketch that I just gave you, the view of nature and of the increasingly internal control exhibited by objects as we move along that scale. This view of nature that Aristotle's theory of causality makes possible, next time I want to try to make it actual by presenting it in some detail. But for today, we'll pause here. Thank you. Thank you, and let's open the floor to questions now. We have about 25 minutes. Yes?
I have two problems in this area. I don't know if they're really problems, but I'll let you decide. The first one, I read reports not too long ago that would seem to indicate that when an individual chooses, presumably, freely to do a certain action, that there is actually some physiological manifestation of the choice before he actually becomes aware of it.
Are these the Benjamin Lebet's experiments?
Well, it would seem to indicate some sort of determinism. How do you react to that?
I believe that what you're referring to is a set of experiments done by a neurophysiologist at San Francisco State called Benjamin Lebet, who found that he had people doing certain voluntary actions, and he was measuring the electrical potential on their from recording up from their scalp, and found a certain specific potential connected with action which occurred prior to their conscious awareness of the urge to act. Does that sound like what you're...
Yeah.
That's the only real clear physiological evidence of that kind that I know about. All right, I had a feeling this question might come up because I read Science News and this article was in Science. I think it was even in the New York Times. Let me just briefly explain what that experiment was, because you need to see the full context. What Lebet did was to have people perform an action of clenching their fists. Right? And he told them to do it without any planning. He says, don't plan it. They just sit in a room, and whenever they have the whim to close their hand, he says, do it. Don't plan it. Don't try to do it at any specific time. But when it happens, when you experience the urge to close your hand, make a note of when that happens. And he allowed them to. He said, notice where the position of a hand on a clock is. Okay? So he could tell when, in objective time, they were first aware of the impulse. Okay? And what he found also, he was recording from their scalps, recording something called a readiness potential, which is a physiological, it's a trend I'll have to draw it. If you record from the scalp, what you get is something like this. Because what you're getting is a record of electrical activity being summed over the entire, or at least over a large area of the brain. And it's regularly been found, I take the scientist's word for this, that there is something here which I can never see when I look at their little graphs, but a little dip, which precedes, if the action occurs at this point in time, occurs about half a second before the action. Okay? And what Lebet found was that the people's awareness of their impulse occurred 0.2 of a second. Only about 0.2 of a second before the act occurred. So this readiness potential, which they think comes from the motor cortex and is therefore a source of the act, preceded the conscious awareness of any impulse to act, and therefore the conclusion is the action was already on its way physiologically to being performed before the person had any clue that he was doing it, so how could he have conscious control? Okay. Now, let me say, first of all, that Lebet himself doesn't draw the conclusion that we don't have free will. His conclusion was free will consists in the ability to have veto power over the act. In other words, the act starts in motion, but you can stop it. And he went on to do some further experiments where I don't know how people perform this act of introspection, because we're talking about milliseconds, we're talking about tenths of a second here prior to an act. He says, when the impulse starts, stop it. Okay, and he found same readiness potential, okay? Awareness, it'd be 0.3 of a second later, but then the act didn't occur. Okay, so Lebet himself thinks it's free will, but he thinks it's only veto power over impulses that are generated by the subconscious. Okay, now, before I give you my answer, let me ask, does anyone have any objection to the character of this experiment? Yes?
I think that that reading that starts just before the guy wants to clench his fist is already following his decision to do that, whether how conscious that decision was, because it's an easy action to do. I think that's part of the whole action, not something that precedes the man wanting to take the action, but it's part of the decision to take the action.
But you said the decision was not conscious.
Well,
and so Lebet could say, okay, call it a decision if you want, but what that means is that you're not consciously the source of the act.
Maybe a degree of conscious. It is conscious, but not you're not focused on it very sharply, because it's such a simple action. That's a degree of consciousness.
Okay, I will certainly accept the point about the simplicity of the action, the character of the act being important here. But let me go on and see what other answers people come up with. Yes?
The experiment requires a decision to note a time, and that decision can only occur after the original decision to move the hand, i.e. 0.2 of a second later. You pay attention to the time, but you only do that after you've moved your hand.
But they were...
And there's even a timing involved between the eyes and the brain, which you'll lose some time in.
Well,
How are they measuring time that accurately?
there are some questions that have been raised about the validity of this measurement technique. But what they do is, there's a big hand, like a child's clock, moving along, and you note the time when it is you remember where the hand was when you make the choice or experience the impulse to act. Your first conscious awareness of any impulse to act. I think they corrected for any time lag between the transmission from the eye to the brain. I believe they corrected for that. That some effect remains after you correct for that. Okay, let me get one more, and yes.
Do you not make the choice when you're told to clench your hand? You've made a choice, in a sense, to program your subconscious that you're going to do that at some point. So the original choice is made before you even got into the room, and then when you do it, you're sort of previously aware that you're going to.
Okay, I would say that, in combination with the other comments, that's exactly right. This act is something you're told to do. You're not told to consciously plan when you're going to do it, but you're told to set your subconscious to clench your hand. We do not go around clenching our hands like this unless we have some problem. You do have to give your subconscious an order, generate some whims, generate some impulses, okay? And then it would make perfect sense to me that you would not become aware of it until the action is already underway. This context, taking an act that was specifically intended to have no specific meaning for the person, to be a completely arbitrary, random act, would not require any focus. It's something that your subconscious can do without much trouble. It would not. The whole situation is one which, because of the nature of the act involved, wouldn't bear on particularly on the choice to focus. Okay. Ed.
I haven't read this, but I read the same thing you did. I'm willing to bet you it's an artifact of measurement, the timing, because you look at it introspectively in a situation like that. How are you going to decide when to do it? You're going to say to yourself now, okay? But you have the duration of the percept thing, the clock. You have the duration of the thought. You have the duration of recording the thought, as somebody said. And how can he measure? And the decision might not take place instantaneously. How can he measure all of those processes properly? And just a little error in any of those could completely throw off the data. I know, I'm willing to bet you it's conscious, and he didn't measure all the steps involved. I'm just betting that if somebody redoes it right. If it was subconscious, it would be more like, it seems to me, like when you see the red light, do it, and you program it without even thinking. Then it might be simultaneous. Right. But in a case like this, you have to say to yourself now, and I bet you if you measured the lag time that takes, and the duration of the percept to see the clock, that he didn't include all of those things in the measurement. I'm not even sure how you could do it. And I haven't seen actual statistical data, but I'm suspicious of it.
I'm not sure. That's certainly possible. And in that case, then the experiment would have zero significance. I read his summary in a, not the original research papers, but in an interdisciplinary journal. It's kind of a summary of it. And I thought he had some way of correcting or taking account, at least of the perceptual transmission process.
Seeing the clock and recording it itself is a lag, much less deciding then to act on that perception. And can he measure the duration of all of those accurately? Or did
Well, that's a good question. I couldn't really give you an answer on that. Okay. Yes, Michael.
In your talk, when you introduced the term causality, one of the things you said about it was that when an entity, the same entity in the same circumstance, would produce the same action.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably, then that doesn't. Is that true of causality in general? Was that an example or a false view of causality? I presume that doesn't apply to human beings then.
I believe it does apply to human beings, but you have to understand properly what it means to have the same cause in that context. That's something I'm going to talk about next time. Next time I'll try to show you that it is true that if you had the same cause, same person, in exactly the same circumstances in all relevant respects, then you would get the same result, but that is not a violation of volition. Okay, so that'll be at the end of my talk next time. Okay, yes, you can.
I think in this experiment, if I did not focus on the object of the experiment, I would never clench my fist.
Right, but remember what these subjects are being asked to do. They would have to be in a high state of focus, I think. I don't know if I could do it. They have to stay in touch with this impulse. So that they're focusing as observers on their own introspective state. Okay? It's not like they're focusing on some reality, life decision. Shall I clench or shall I not? And what reasons are relevant and which ones shall I focus on and how much attention do I need to pay to all these factors? They were instructed to just let it happen. Now maybe as Dr. Locke says, there's no way to make it a fully automatic process, but the focus they would exert, I would think, would be mainly directed at trying to see where the hand of the clock is at the very moment that they're feeling this impulse. Yes?
Did they attempt at all to try and find out if there was any delay between the electrical impulse and if someone was trying to consciously do something?
You know, when does that readiness potential occur in volitional action?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think they found that it occurred somewhat earlier in that case.
Somewhat earlier,
yeah.
Not precisely the same.
Right. No. In the case where the individual was trying to plan to do it at some specific instant, it would occur on the order of 1 second before the action. But I mean, that's understandable. You would, be watching the clock now, and you have to exert control in that sense. Yes, I think you had your.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand here. Am I correct in understanding that we do not choose to choose, and yet this is my big problem with free will, and yet trying to avoid that seemingly infinite regress that we don't choose to focus, and I may be misunderstanding, the situation here, but that's my problem.
I want to make sure that I understand the problem.
Yeah, trying to choose to focus, like what sets in your mind? How do you sort of initiate the process or whatever?
Well, the things I can say about what it means to choose to focus, but precisely because it is an act that is under our fundamental control, I can't give you an answer in terms of, well, in order to focus, you do go through procedures A, B, and C, because then procedures A, B, and C would be the ones that you're in direct volitional control of. I mean, volition is a primary, a causal primary as well as an epistemological primary. It's not something that you can break down further into sub-causes, some sequence of operations that you perform in the course of doing it. You do it. So the only way to explain, to answer your question, I think, would be to give you a fuller description, perhaps, of what it is that you're choosing if you choose to focus, or what it is you're choosing if you choose not to focus. But the choice itself, I don't think, can be any more fully elaborated.
I think that my problem originated once when I heard Harry Binswanger just trying to elaborate on free will, and he suggested that he gave the example of when you say wake up in the morning, or you're asleep and you wake up and you're in a subconscious state while you're asleep, and you sort of wake up and you sort of shake your head, and he sort of gave that as an example of, in a sense, using your free will, or sort of waking it up or turning it on or whatever. And that's where the problem came from, is where does this come from? Sort of turning on your consciousness or whatever, I don't know.
Well, that would be one context in which it's kind of a specialized context. Usually the choice to focus, you're not, in a completely unconscious state at the outset. And if you are, a certain physiological activity has to occur before you're in a position to choose to exert choice. I mean, you have to be conscious for one thing. And so in that context, the choice to focus would be something that happens at the last stage, where you say, you're conscious and you're just kind of, rolling around, and you decide to take control, as opposed to just, drifting and dazing. But it's, no matter what context it is, it's a choice that you exercise directly. If you ask, can you choose to focus? Well, in a sense, no. That choice is imposed on you by the nature of your brain. You are at every moment in a position of choosing what level of mental effort you're going to exert. Okay, yes?
Seems to me that could be similar to a validation of free will. It could certainly fit in those experimental data. If you had something like a race car driver, well, he in fact would want to shorten that gap between, almost to make it a reflex. He wanted to shorten the veto period of his consciously, if he sees something coming up, he wants to shorten the time between this, the dip, you called it the readiness reflex. He would want to shorten that time. So, but that would still be a result of his, prior to this, considering this thing, programming it.
Well, I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't know whether that is subject to variation, or whether it's part of some sort of fixed reaction time phenomenon, or what. I don't know whether the readiness potential varies. Perhaps, I don't know if anyone here may know this.
It's almost like asking why existence exists. To ask for antecedent causes the volition of what preceded it. How did you start to choose to choose?
Yes, I mean, it's true.
With the next year. That's what cannot be proved.
Yes and no. I think insofar as volition is a causal primary that is not further reducible to some sequence of operations, that's true. It is, and as with other causal primaries, you can't ask, all right, what's the explanation of this? But in another sense, it is valid. So we're talking, but there we're talking about the actual choice as made by you at a given instant. I do think it is possible, and this is one respect in which volition differs from something like existence. It is possible to explain where the capacity comes from.
Well, something has given rise to it.
Right. Right, and that's the material that I'm going to try to cover next time. But volition is a specific capacitive phenomenon in nature, and it arose somehow through the course of evolution. And so in that sense, the capacity will have a cause, and I assume will be explainable. I'm even going to try to offer at least the broad outline of an explanation. But you're right that once we have the capacity, whether we exercise it or not is primary and not subject to explanation. Yes?
You have the choice to focus as the choice to think. Before I become involved with activity, I studied some of the Eastern religions. It seems like they would focus on something like a mantra and not to think. Can you relate that?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know the phenomenon that's part of many Eastern religions of putting the mind into a state of quiescence of some kind by chanting a mantra or focusing on an imaginary visual object and trying to exclude all other thoughts and sort of damp down the mind. This raises a question that's very much like the question of how do we fall asleep? Because in fact, the brain state that they achieve is very much like sleep. I would imagine, and this is speculation, that in a sense they do begin by exercising a certain kind of focus, of not of trying to integrate, in this case, but trying to focus and concentrate the mind in a contemplative way on just a single object. But, I mean, what the mind does is it thinks, it integrates, it goes through a conscious process. So if you use the capacity to focus to prevent the mind from doing what it's designed to do, and I think this is the intent, it shuts down the mind, and it's not surprising to me that that can produce a state of passivity. And in fact, sometimes one way to get to sleep, to try to calm down what the TM people call the chatter in your mind, to slow down your racing thoughts, is to concentrate on sensations of in your muscles or whatever. And sometimes but the product there is not. I mean, it's a kind of a paradoxical case, because you focus in order to put you out of the need of having to focus, i.e., put you asleep. So, yes, in the back.
As far as this guy's experiment goes, it seems like what he's doing is a kind of post-hypnotic suggestion that these things are emanating from the person's, these choices to clench are emanating from the person's subconscious. And if the signal comes out of the person's subconscious and goes to their muscles to clench, their conscious awareness of that impulse has to come after the subconscious is sent. So it seems to me as a result it's perfectly reasonable. But it doesn't have really anything to do with free will, because the actual choice to program their subconscious this way has come many, many cycles previous to the actual clenching. And the blip that he should be looking for is really as he's explaining the experiment to the guy what he wants him to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I agree. I think that's a very good statement of the hypothesis that I would adopt. It's a little different from Dr. Locke's, and I wouldn't begin to say that this experiment tells us which of the two are true. But yeah, I think that's probably what is happening. Okay. Is anyone else before I call on Michael? Have I called on you yet?
Yes, one.
All right. Anyone else? I want to give everyone a chance. All right, you're on. You have.
When we can choose to focus, increase the level of our awareness. But to what extent can we choose the content of that focus? Are there two choices there, or is it just one, and then we sort of get the content given to us by the subconscious?
Well, I would say that primarily we choose the level of awareness, and the contents are supplied by whatever purposes we have, whatever standing orders we've given to our subconscious, in effect. For example, you are now in a state of focus, I'm sure. If I say, who's the first president of the U.S., okay, a certain mental content will swim into your minds, right? George Washington. But, and that's right, isn't it? Look at you, these puzzled looks. I would say, in that case, it's a clear example of in that case, I've given a standing order to your subconscious and I've gotten an answer. But within the realm of conscious awareness, there are going to be things that are central and things that are peripheral, things you're dimly aware of, things in the back of your mind, on the tip of your tongue, this phenomenon. And within that, you focus is partly choosing which contents that are, in some sense, in your consciousness to bring into the forefront. And so in that sense, it is a selective process as well as a increasing the intensity or level process. Yeah?
Explain why it's not concept stealing on the part of the proponent of free will when he makes free will arguments and the determinist can just say that those arguments are determined, the free will arguments themselves. Why that isn't concept stealing on the part of the free will proponent?
Well, I think it is concept stealing. He's stealing the concept of logic, evidence, standards from the fact that is the basis for the possibility of those concepts, which is volition. So you could say that the problem is he's stealing the concept. It's like a determinist who had a passionate moral view or elaborated a code of ethics. He'd say you're stealing the concept of ethics from one of its preconditions. So I would say it is concept stealing. And that's a good identification. Okay, thank you.